let's get down to it here. We're going to be working with chapter 6 today. So, emotion, arousal, stress, anxiety, all the things that work with emotion. So, this is the Blackboard section of it. So, let's pull the PowerPoint up. Let's go from here. Apologies for last week. It was been really hectic, and I know it's all been pretty hectic for you all too with everything that's been transitioning. So let's get back on track. Let me get back on track so that we can get ourselves in order here. So yeah, chapter 6. This week it'll be chapter 6, 7, and 9, not 8, but 9. So emotion is going to come up first, and like I said, emotion, we're going to specifically talk about arousal, stress, and anxiety, and just be prepared to have a what is that called? An assignment based on this right here, okay? So let's kind of get down to the nitty gritty of it. So we know that with sport, with exercise, with a lot of things, emotion is definitely part of the process. Even if you take something like a Monopoly, for example. Monopoly is a game that is meant to be fun. And it's meant to, you're supposed to, conquest the board. But by doing so, what ends up happening is you put this word in there, and being competitive just totally makes and breaks that game. You could take a game like Pictionary. You could take a basketball game, a pickup basketball game, and make it going from fun to absolutely ridiculous in 2.5 seconds because you can't keep the emotions in check, or you can't just have the fun of it, But again, if you're a competitive person, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means that, that's just how the nature of how it's going to go. All right. Part of the issue, though, is it's something that each coach, each exercise trainer, strength coach, whatever, you have to keep emotions in check. And it's always a concern. We always want the proper amount of emotion that's built, because you don't want to be underutilizing emotion. You don't want to be overutilizing emotion. You want to have that fine line. Okay? So when we talk about this stuff as we move forward, we're going to be talking about these 3 things down here. All right? Chronic and acute stress, chronic and acute anxiety, and then arousal. Okay? Chronic meaning long term, acute meaning in the moment or the now or in the short term. So stress, anxiety, and arousal in those situations. Okay? So what does it mean for things to be ideal? Well, it's kind of a loaded question, like what really is ideal? The thing about it, though, is that it really does depend on this. It definitely depends on the type of sport. And if you have a football player, they are going to have an ideal amount of emotional control versus somebody who is playing basketball, who is playing baseball, who is playing soccer. Okay, now, are there similarities in some of that? Sure. All right. Look at combat sports. I mean, there is some sort of emotional control that needs to happen when you're in a combat sport, whether it be, martial arts, whether it be boxing. There's still, it's a similar type. So there might be similar emotional control stages or sets or status. Okay. The position that which the athlete is playing. Well, okay, so so now you're going to go type of sport. So you got football. Position-wise, I mean, I'm sure you can think of a bunch of different positions in football. So let's just say a linebacker or a lineman who is going to have a lot of contact on every play, and somebody like a wide receiver who is going to try to catch the ball and try to make a play. Well, there is an ideal amount of emotion, but with a lineman, there's going to be more of an aggressive approach, more of an arousal, less anxiety, maybe more stress because they have to protect the quarterback, especially as an offensive lineman. So you can see how different areas, different arenas within that specific sport might be a big deal. All right. They talk about the situation within a particular contest. So, you always talk about it's the 9th inning, 2 outs, bottom of the ninth, and the count's 3-2, and you got a runner on third, and you're down by, and the game's tied. That situation right there is stressful. Doesn't matter who you are. Well, if you let that stressful situation turn into an anxiety moment where you start to then become off of who you normally are as a person, well, then there you go. You see where you're going with that. And then lastly, the needs and personalities of each athlete. Okay? Each athlete is its own beast, its own animal. Each exerciser is their own beast and their own animal. And you have to be able to manipulate these control centers for emotion, because no two people are going to react the same way. Well, I mean, people will react the same way, but they may not. It's not the same. Okay, even the way that people come to conclusions with things, the way that they get to certain things, you see where I'm going with that. Okay, but really that's what it comes down to, is it has to be individualized for the needs and that person's personality. Just like if you're in class, like I can joke around about something, but I also have to be aware about the next person and the next person and the next person. Okay, so that's where that comes into play. So what is stress? Okay, like it says, like what they say here, refers to the present bodily or cognitive responses to an environmental demand. Okay, the demand can be interpreted as positive or negative. So you can't have good and bad stress. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. But ultimately, what we're saying here, present bodily or cognitive responses. Stress is how the body is going to react both physically and mentally toward a demand that's placed on them through the environment. Okay, a child who is around an abusive relationship, and maybe they're not being physically abused, but maybe the situation is very different. There's going to be stress on them, not physically but emotionally, and that attaches to them. Okay, an athlete who has a very difficult job, with just say contact. Maybe the position that they play doesn't warrant contact, but you got a player on the other team who has shown more contact. That can cause stress. Again, and in that case, it's both physical and mental. So it's really, really difficult for certain situations where a player or an exerciser is not used to a certain situation, that the stress level typically will increase. Okay, a stressor, on the other hand, is any demand on the mind or the body. Okay, so stress is that actual response to the demand. A stressor is that demand that is causing the stress, and then a distressor is a demand resulting in harm. Okay, so distress is obviously not a positive thing. All right, so let me just make sure here. Yep, so let's just talk about it really quickly. I'll kind of put these terms down on the map here. What are we talking about in terms of, let me just make sure that, I want to make sure that we can see all this. Okay, so you have basically you have a bunch of different things that you can talk about in terms. So you have eustress, we talked about distress, and eustress. Okay, eustress is actual positive stress. Okay, distress is that negative stress that we talked about, and it sounds kind of weird, but eustress is actually neutral stress, where eustress is positive stress. So like exercising is a positive stressor. It's physically and mentally potentially stressing the body and the mind, but at the same time it's a positive distractor. Distress is where if mom's yelling at you for not mowing the lawn, well then that's going to provide you with negative stress. Okay, that's distress. And eustress means that you basically are kind of neutral, hence the new part of everything. You don't really have that positive or negative. You're kind of just, there really isn't a stress that's there. Even though the situation might seem stressful or not stressful, there really isn't this feeling that stress is involved. So that's the difference between the two. So definitely know the difference between those three, especially when you get to your testing, okay? as far as stress management goes, what are we trying to do with athletes and exercisers here? We're trying to, like I said, manage the environment, build resources. So create this resourcefulness where you can, basically take control of that situation. And then you need to be able to have the athlete or exerciser interpret their surroundings to see if it really is harmful or threatening. And if it's not, then we have to try to, take and change their mindset to that. So like it says here, an athlete's interpretation, another word for that is what we would call appraisal. Okay, how we appraise a certain situation, how we interpret a certain situation. So those are the three ways that, stress management can really come into play. Manage the environment if it can be managed. If you're, like home versus away in that situation, well, we understand that that's going to be difficult to manage the environment because it's not your environment that you can manage. All right. When you look at resources or resourcefulness, confidence, optimism, self-control, mental toughness, coping skills, all of those things are necessary in terms of becoming more resourceful, becoming more in tune to what you have available to you to use to control your stress. Okay. If you lack confidence, stress can be a little bit more in your mind. If you're pessimistic versus optimistic, you see where I'm going with this. If you lack self-control, the ability for you to control your own self, that means you're going to stress you more. So there you go. Okay. So anxiety, okay, it says it reflects negative feelings of worry or threat about a future event. So nothing has happened yet. You can't be anxious. What's the best way to put this? You can't be anxious if something has already happened. Okay, so let's take the if you go to YouTube and you look at like the crazy people that climb like these towers and they climb these massive they're way up in the air and they're on these cliffs that you can only stand like one person on it, and you're sitting there and you're looking at it and you're watching this video and you're like, oh, and your palms start sweating and you start getting freaked out. Well, it's not because it basically you're getting anxious because if you were to ever do that in the future, it would freak you out. All right, there's a worry or a threat that's causing you to feel that way. Okay. The problem is that unlike stress, anxiety is negative. Okay, anxiety is, as they say, unpleasant. Really, because there is a worry or a threat that really shows you that it's not going to be positive. Okay, so there's not going to be a positive manner to anxiety. It's always going to be so if someone is deemed to be anxious or they have anxiety in the now, then ultimately what we're saying is that we got to be able to change that and we got to be able to make that work because we need to get that anxiety out of them so that we can help them as much as possible. Okay. Now, I mean, we get to the point where, you might have players that are actually on medication for anxiety. So you just never know. But it's always about trying to remove that worry or threat if possible. All right. So what do we have here? We have two different types of anxiety. We have somatic and we have cognitive. Now, somatic means with a physiological approach with, that. Now, don't think just movement. We're talking about anything physiological within the body. Cognitive is more mental. It's more about the feelings, more about the mindset. Okay, so like it says here, somatic anxiety is like the reactionary stuff. So upset stomach, start sweating, increased heart rate, change in skin color, twitching, a lot of the, pacing, those types of things are more physiological. Whereas with cognitive, that's where you're going to constantly have that negative thought. You're going to always have that unpleasant feeling that's driving through the back of your head, okay? So with anxiety, you also have state anxiety. So what we're saying here is, and so what they call that is, so state anxiety or a state, all right, conscious feelings of apprehension and tension due mainly to the individual's perception of the present or upcoming situation. What state are you currently in? State anxiety is the state of the situation, the state of the threat, okay? And when is it now in the present or is it upcoming? That is state anxiety, okay? So when you talk about state anxiety, it's in the moment, okay? It's the anxiety within that state of being where you're at, okay? And like it says here, fluctuates over time, okay? So, but that makes sense because every part of a situation or a state is not always consistent. So there's those highs and those lows, there's those peaks and those valleys. Well, there you go. Okay. Trait anxiety, on the other hand, is personality trait. Okay. We're talking about how you as a person, the traits that you're made up of, or you as the person, what is it that you are made up of that's causing this anxiety? Okay. So a person who typically has trait anxiety, they're typically going to be the ones that are going to end up causing an issue in state anxiety simply because the fact that they just are naturally predisposed to feeling some way of a negative feeling. Because ultimately, if you go back to the anxiety part of it, they have a worry or a threat. Okay? And that right there is the main reason why. They feel like that something with them is causing them to have this threat or worry, so because of how they are as a person. Okay? So we got to be aware of that. And now this is, again, the more you get to know your exercises, the more you get to know your athletes, you can start to try to develop some sort of cues, some sort of focus points that can potentially help with this. All right? Now, this is not the here's the funny thing is that we assume that, the high level, high performing athlete does not experience this. Well, they do. They're just the ones that can handle it a heck of a lot better than a person who is either an amateur, a newbie. Okay, and that's really what it comes down to, is that the elite athlete is the one that can take it and they can control it, and then they can potentially use that threat to then propel them to do something great. Okay, so you look at it, drop yourself all the way down to a middle school basketball player. And understand that in a specific situation, that threat or that worry is going to wear on them, and then they're going to struggle. But as they progress to high school level, that threat may not be as bad. As they get to the college level, it's really not going to, it's going to feel a little bit less stressful, and basically the anxiety is going to be minimized. And then once they get to that elite, it may be there, but they can just, kind of shrug it off. Okay. Now, arousal, like they say here, they say that there's another term that kind of works with it called activation. So what is it? Natural, ongoing state measured as a physiological process on a continuum ranging from really low to really high. Okay? So either comatose, like you have no reaction to it, or extremely excitable, or something is super exciting. Okay? So basically with arousal, it's the excitement that brews in a person that can spill out and then cause you to have these intense moments, okay? Think about a power lifter. Have you ever watched powerlifting videos, ever been to a powerlifting meet before? You see them, they take in the smelling salts before they go, and they're just like, raw, and they get going. And the reason why they get that is because they need to get into this optimal arousal state where they can just, they're so in tune to what's going on, yet they're so pumped up. Now, interestingly enough, that's a power lifter. You can't take a ballerina and have a ballerina go out on stage with smelling salts and get going and be in that moment where they're just, Hulk state. Okay, so you can see the difference between how arousal needs to be optimized for the particular person. Okay. Other terms, though, I really like drive, arousal, so drive, activation, readiness, or excitation. All of those are really positive words. But again, too much drive, too much activation, too much readiness, too much excitement, or not enough, you can see where we're going to have that happen. If you have not enough arousal, the ability to become excited and to get yourself pumped up is not there. Overdoing it can create that negative part of it where you're going to go overboard and not be able to perform accordingly. Excuse me, sorry. So with arousal, what are you talking about? Again, physiological changes, heart and respiration rates. Obviously, when arousal goes up, those do. You might become a little bit more of a sweater. I don't mean like one that you put on your back. I mean like sweating more. Okay. And those are just a couple different examples there. Red skin, tingling feelings, all that good stuff. But it just depends on the person. So with positive arousal, what are you talking about? You're talking about joy, elation, ecstasy, interest, happiness, and love. Okay. Now, that's the positive feelings that you get from that aroused state. On the other hand, negative arousal, fear, anger, anxiety, jealousy, embarrassment, disgust, boredom, or rage. You can see that there's a massive difference in those terms, more, from the positive to the negative, just by listening to what it is. Fear, anger, anxiety, oh boy, jealousy, that's not good. So you see they're all those negative connotations, So optimal arousal is key for that. All right. So when we talk about the differences, though, make sure that you understand that arousal is a physical response, anxiety is a cognitive response. So arousal is going to cause a physiological change. It's going to cause some sort of change in, the body state. Anxiety is going to cause a change in the mind state. Okay. And that's really how the difference lies. But what do we need to do? What do we really need to think about, and what do we need to do? Well, we need to manage these because we can't have too much. We can't have too little. It's okay to be anxious. It's not okay to take. You can't just say, no, stop it. Like when someone says to you, you know what, just relax. What do? You become more unrelaxed, and you just start having this meltdown internally, like, don't tell me to relax, So that becomes a little bit of a difference there. So that's where we need to look at it from that standpoint. But we need to regulate. But we can't, and this is where regulate and don't do what I just said, don't eliminate. You have to be able to allow these things to occur naturally because this will allow you to be able to function accordingly the way that you're supposed to. I just think that, sometimes coaches try to manage things too much, and by taking away the ability to get super pumped up, like you see it in professional sports all the time. The coach doesn't, unless it's going to cause a negative reaction, coaches let their players do their thing. Sometimes coaches will take the technical foul and get a technical foul against them simply because they know what it'll do to their team, and that this is where we go with that, because we know that maybe they needed that jolt, they needed that quick punch in the head, metaphorical punch in the head, not a physical punch, like actual. So, that's where it comes down where, with optimal arousal, that's where, if you're feeling low and the coach comes out and is like, start yelling at the ref and yelling at the ref and yelling at the ref, then all of a sudden they get bing, get the T, technical foul. It's like, oh, coach is looking out for us. We better do something. And that's what an elite level player can do, Exercises are the same way. At some point here, you're, the trainer or the coach is sitting there just kind of like trying to get the most out. And all of a sudden they just, find a way, and the exercise is like, wow, maybe I'm not putting enough effort. Boom, done. There they go. So you got to be aware that you got to be able to regulate, but don't eliminate. In terms of how do we measure it, well, there is something called the Competitive State Anxiety Inventory, or the CSAI-2, that basically a player can take this, and it gives them some sort of feeling about that actual state anxiety. Okay. Now, a couple of terms here. Athlete's subjective state. Now, remember, there's two terms. Okay. So you got objective versus subjective. Okay. Now, objective means that it's observable. You're actually seeing it. Subjective means that it's coming from the person who you are observing. So the athlete's subjective state means it's from how the athlete feels, not about what you observe of that athlete. Okay? So what we're saying here is to measure athlete's subjective feelings about he or she and how they view competitive situations is really one of the most important issues in how we can measure and experience anxiety. So really what we have to understand is that if we can measure that and understand how they feel in those state anxious moments, we can potentially move those into different ways to cue, different ways to coach, different ways to talk about specific things. Okay, so just kind of interesting. So, other things, physiological techniques, what we can do is we can actually, we can determine through physiological reactions how, a player reacts. Now, that's the really cool thing now is you have all these devices that you can kind of hook up to people. You have these EMG, waves that you can determine by hooking up these monitors to the brain. And basically can tell you when you start to fire off brain synapses, more under certain situations. You can wear a heart rate monitoring strap. You can wear a watch that has that ability to take that on. And really what you're doing is you're trying to get an idea of, what's going on. Okay? And that can be really important for that player because you're kind of detecting things in the moment. So with anxiety, though, these are some of the things that you're going to find in a player or someone who's getting a little bit off, okay? And definitely I'm having this highlighted because you might need to know this for your test coming up, all right? But twitching, pacing, frequent urination, too much talking, speaking, okay, I'm not anxious, by the way, because this is typically me, speaking in a loud, obnoxious manner, all right? No, that's like, if it's out of character for that person, a person who's normally calm, if they start going a little bit off the chain, like they start doing that a little bit, you get the idea. And then unfriendly temperament, again, if it's changed from, if you have a person who's standoffish, well, are they more standoffish? If you have a person who's really kind of a nice person, are they really starting to become like, segregated and isolated and closed off? So you can see where we're going with that. But really, it's one of these things, a coach definitely needs to know when these anxiety moments are hitting, and they got to find a way to help these people because it's only going to hurt the whole team, not just the one player. All right. So we did talk about positive stress, also known as, or AKA, eustress. All right. Positive stress is good. We kind of hit on that. Zest and enjoyment. You're going to be more attentive and you're going to have more energy. And these are the things that you're going to be able to do. Deadline meeting. You have an ability to enter new situations without a problem. You can deal with emergency situations a little bit easier, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's positive stress to the max. But it is positive energy. Okay, and so one of the cool things though is that it's not going to tax your system. Okay. We know that with positive stress, it's gonna, in the moment it may be stressful, but it's not taxing the emotional and the mental component, even though the physical might be kind of beat up a little bit. Like exercise, you're beating up the physical, but it's helping the emotional and the mental state that you are being in. Okay, so that's just part of training. Okay. And so what we need to worry about is, so how do we maintain balance? Like they say here, voluntary recovery. Take the time to be involved in the recovery process. People who don't take the break are the ones that are going to start going from being this eustress, positive stress, into that negative distress, which we don't want, okay? But you got to be able to take the time and move on, all right? But here's that recovery part. Voluntary recovery, it's actually planned. Involuntary is when you start to break down. Now, I think you can see where we're going with this. What do we rather have, voluntary or involuntary? We want voluntary. But this is the point here where involuntary should be the sign for a person or a player or an exerciser that, okay, it's time for a break because they're starting to get sick. Now, that doesn't mean like cough, cough, sick. It just means like, they're getting sick. They're showing signs and symptoms of breakdown, okay? And then, then it can lead to even depression. So now you're talking about mental sickness, okay? So that's where we need to be aware of it. Plan that recovery time, and you perfect the recovery, and you'll perfect the performance, and that's really important for that. All right. With it though, what are you looking for? You're looking to just re-energize. After that recovery period, that person comes back and wham, they're refreshed, they're ready to go, they have a fresh sense of what's going on. Okay. and it's going to distract them. Okay, it's going to take them out of what might be bothering them in that moment and kind of change the mindset of what's going on. So re-energize and distract. Now, distraction is not a bad thing in this moment because we want to take them out of the moment and we want to get them to be, in a different sort of situation. Okay, so moving forward, all right, well, we talked about this word appraisal before, cognitive appraisal. So basically, taking a look at or, observing the mental side of everything and how, players are, anxious or how they're stressed, okay? Because if we take a look at that and we look at it over and over again, we can kind of determine where we got to be in the help process to get these players and exercises to where they need to be, okay? So there's a lot of different theories. Okay, so there's a bunch of different theories that came from this. What they talk about is something called drive theory. It's dependent upon, what they're saying here is that performance is dependent upon drive and habit. So let's take the elite level athlete. Okay, we know that an elite level athlete has a ton of drive because they're and a lot of it comes from it comes from a lot of different factors, but a lot of it comes from for elite status, they're trying to make money. Okay, they want to make the most money, but again, they do it, but they're also doing it because they love the game. It's not just a job, it's that their drive is to win. Okay? So if you have that drive and you have really good habits, your performance is going to be through the roof. Now, there obviously isn't any number factors that we're talking about with this theory, but you get where we're going with that. The more drive you have and the more habit strength you have, the higher your performance. Now, you also have these elite level players who don't have good habits. So their performance, although their drive might be high, their habits are not great. So their performance is basically subpar to what it could be. Okay. So what that ends up being, though, is one of those things where you have to figure out how can we get these players to have better habits, and so that's one of the things where in high school sports, some players just don't have the drive, but they have really good habits, and some players have really good drive but no habits. So it's just it could be one or the other, but you want to obviously have both if you can help it. All right. So we have to have that optimal level of drive and that optimal level of habit strength, and we'll get optimal performance out of that. There's also something called an inverted U, which basically means that if you take the U and you flip it upside down, so inverted meaning upside, it's going to be the other way. So basically you have almost like a rainbow. What they're saying is that rainbow, or that U that, is in that direction, on the two ends, that's the lowest points that you could have, okay? So on the left side of the U, the inverted U, you basically have this low sense of arousal. So therefore, when you have a low sense of arousal, you basically are kind of hurting yourself in that. Let's see if we can get it. Oh, here we go. Not going to let me put it in. There we go. Should be there now. Okay. So if we look at the inverted U, let's beef it up a little bit here. Cool. Okay, so what we're saying here is in this moment, you have on this end low arousal, so therefore you're going to have low performance. But as you start to creep up, as the arousal level increases, so does performance. And then you get to this point where you plateau. If you're following my mouse here, the cursor right here, right in the middle, that's what we would call the optimal performance zone. And the reason why we call that the optimal performance zone is because that's the peak. That means that you've hit enough arousal, or the highest level of arousal that you've gotten, and it's going to show the highest level of performance because you're not making mental mistakes. So if you get over more to the right here and you start to then drop down on that inverted U, what we're saying is that you're becoming overly aroused, and that's declining performance. So you have declined performance as you get not enough arousal, and you'll have declined performance when you have too much arousal. Think about it from the perspective of, I remember there was the Seahawks when they were in the Seattle Seahawks when they were in the Super Bowl. I forget what year it was. I can't remember off the top of my head. But I remember the first play, the first kickoff, they were playing the Patriots. And the kickoff happened, and running the ball back was a Seahawks player, and he fumbled on the very first part of it. He fumbled on the kickoff. And that typically isn't because that player is not good. It's just because of the fact that you go into this game and you're hyped up and things are different and it's slightly different and you're not here. Again, follow, on that inverted U, where's my mouse? There we go. All right. You're not here. They're over here. They're overstimulated, so that becomes a problem. Okay? So we got to look at it from that perspective, and it does kind of make a lot of sense. That really does make a lot of sense. All right? And then we have also what was called the individualized zone of optimal performance. Like, basically what we're saying is that each person has, where their zone is. Okay? What zone are you in the zone? You ever heard that before? Are you in the zone? That's what we're talking about there. Okay? So there's also something called the Catastrophe Theory. And that basically just means it's really, it's a catastrophe. It's basically saying that, the more overly aroused and more anxious a person gets, the larger decline in, it's going to be, or what we want to call a decline that's more large and it's more dramatic. Okay? So we have to be able to avoid those types of things, all right? So we want to be able to make sure that we take every situation, realistically. We want to make sure that we take every situation and give all specific outcomes that can occur. So, just understand that, that's basically like bombing out or choking. Okay, that's really what we're kind of talking about here. If you continue to overstimulate and overactivate and overarouse someone, or overexcite, then it's just gonna, it's gonna fizzle out, and you're not gonna be able to get the performance you need. The reversal theory, what we're talking about here, so what we're basically able to say is, you're able to take and look at arousal from two different components: the excitement component and the anxiety component. All right. So what we're saying is that in a aroused or in an aroused state, a person is going to be excited versus anxious. Okay, and then in low arousal, what you're talking about is relaxation versus boredom. And you can see the difference between the two in terms of the terminology. Obviously, one is definitely way more positive than the other. Okay, that's what we're referring to here is with the reversal. Is that, although, just because you're in a low arousal state, well, yeah, you should be, because, like, especially when you're recovering, you can't always be up. Okay, you can't always be on. So what we're saying here is that under low arousal states, like when you're just trying to, like, relax, that's exactly it. But if you're bored, that just means that you're turning that low arousal into something that's unpleasant. Okay, so always keep the mind going in terms of, like, keep your mind going even under lower aroused states. So, what do we, how do we determine it? How do we determine what optimal arousal is? And it's tough. It really is, because each person reacts differently to certain things. Every player reacts differently to certain things. And really, what are we trying to do? Like it says there, determine the difference between feeling up versus feeling uptight. And that really is true. Okay? So there's a few things that need to happen in that situation, but we have to make sure that you got to be careful of how you present different things. So what they talk about down here is Competitors' arousal level immediately prior to and during the contest should be compared with their subsequent performance. About their performance. Don't start comparing them to other things. And then afterwards, the coach and the athlete could, determine where changing the arousal level before or after, before or during contest can be changed, because maybe the coach didn't give enough oomph. Maybe the coach gave too much and overstimulated their players. So it's got to be something that's constantly in the works. All right. So what do we have to look at in terms of like determining it? We have to self-monitor our feelings, prior to and during competition. You want to be able to, understand if athletes can accurately determine how they feel. And then you want to be able to take and remind them to use different or specific physical and mental strategies that will help them mentally. Okay, so you can't, that's going to be one of those things that we can do to make sure that we are getting them in that optimal zone of mental state. Okay. So what can a coach do? Well, to reduce anxiety and arousal, this list right here of 11 different things. Okay. Let's see. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but have high but realistic expectations. That's always critical, because expectations are good, but over expecting, or having too overly expectation wise, it can really hurt a player, because then they're trying to do more than they need to in the moment. Keep errors in perspective. Don't go off the chain on that. Don't talk about team records. And really, the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory for that. But those are things that you can do in terms of game prep. So pre-contests, you got to be very careful, okay? Because you got to be able to make sure you can take what you know how to do and use it correctly. Because again, you got to work toward the advantage of your people, okay? But you want to increase your voice intensity, not too much, but enough. Bright lighting, make things like clapping is always kind of cool. I'm sure you've probably either played against other players that had like a clap that was a certain way. I remember playing basketball in high school. There was this one team that had a clap, and you're just like, oh god, and it made you hate it, but it also got in your head a little bit, and you're just like, ugh. But it is what it is. Make sure that your nonverbal cues are on point. Okay, if you're starting to get a little frustrated in the pregame or pre-contest situation, you can't show it like that, but you got to pull things aside and kind of cut it out. Physical contact is always good. Sometimes your hand on a player's back can be comforting, and it can show that you're caring in the moment. Use first names. Setting immediate performance goals. You want to set them in the now. Okay. Sometimes having starting lineup announcements can be really good, because it gets players in that moment where they're pumped up, but not overly pumped up. And then, like it says here, there's that light physical exercise again. All right. At halftime, it's all about, like it says there, halftime should be about adjusting, regrouping, reviewing, and then, relaxing, and then exchanging information. It should not be one-sided. Okay. Athletes should be able, one of the things that you cannot do is force them to start getting pumped up. They are allowed to be quiet. They're allowed to be calm, okay? But they also need to start preparing for the next half, even though you're going to be telling them specific things as a coach, all right? But one of the things that I like sometimes, and I kind of worked with a couple of coaches on this, not that I'm a sports psychologist, but I kind of know and understand about what it is coaches need to kind of just let their players go back to the locker room and let them go back on their own terms. The coach shouldn't be going back to the locker room with them, blah, 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 this and blah, blah, blah. No, they got to have a couple of, sometimes the halftime of a specific contest, it's not always, a long period of time, but you still got to give them a few minutes to kind of like decompress and maybe talk on their own or do what they have to do, and then go in and explain your theories. Don't give too much information is obviously critical. So you got to be careful to avoid overload. You can't overload and overstimulate, especially younger players, but even experienced players, because they don't want to. They need to only know little things at one time. Okay, that'll definitely help them. So, what do you got to do? 2 or 3 key points. Use visuals. You need to, especially if you're like in a locker room or whatever, or even if you're and this goes for exercisers too. Using a whiteboard is cool for that. Using things that have visual representation is critical. Also, summarize those things that they need to focus on at the end of whatever it is they're doing, because then that's going to lead them out into to be able to understand what they got to do. All right. And then, sometimes it's hard to do, but you got to find the positives, even though it might be severely negative. All right. Because that's only going to help them to understand, okay, well, we did do some things right, especially in a moment where things were down. Okay. This is a really tough one. Coaches and anger, losing your cool. It's not a good thing to lose your cool and get angry, because typically that anger gets put back toward the players, and that's not positive at all. Okay? So we got to be aware of that as potential coaches and trainers. All right? And that's going to be critical to help them understand. Now, if there's anger toward the refs or to the other team, and players can sometimes rebound off of that and know that the coach is looking out for them, but if it's aimed toward them, it's better to be more informative than to be angry. You got to be able to control the emotion on the sideline. All right. So what are we talking about here? These are 11 different ways to incorrectly strategize. Don't do, we must win, like basically making a really strong statement. We must, we got to win the game. All right. Incorrect goals. Blaming the ref. Now, it's very different than taking it out on the ref. I know it sounds kind of weird, but when again, if players feel like the team is kind of getting unjustly treated, and the coach sticks up for them, that's different than blaming. Okay, but you can't blame them, especially after a game or something like that. Inducing guilt is never good. Reminding players of who's watching, that's not, the superintendent is here and they're really not happy with you all as a team. Or, there's some scouts in the stands that are kind of looking at your performance. Like, you can't let them know that, because that just totally changes the perception of the game. And you can't, don't think that you don't have to explain anything to anyone. That's not true. But the last one here, don't do the double standard of starter, non-starter, double standard. You don't want that. Okay? You don't want that at all, simply because the fact that a starter needs to be treated the same way as a non-starter, and a non-starter has to be treated the same way as a starter. There should not be any unjust that way. And if players see that, that's when things start, then the worry and the threat comes in that you don't have a place on the team. Okay? So how do we manage anxiety? Focusing on what you can control. Think practice. Think back to the practice. Remember that things could always be worse. So remember the worst case scenario. It's not that bad. Keep active, and then use cognitive strategies that can be learned. Okay. So all of anxiety, arousal, stress, they can lead to choking. Okay. Or what they say is an inability to perform up to previously exhibited standards. So if you all know who Alex Rodriguez is, he's one of the, he was probably one of the best hitters that baseball's ever seen, regardless of whether he took steroids or not. But he was the perfect example of choking. He played very well during his seasons, and then when it got to the playoffs, he sucked really bad. All right, and he choked in the moments that he should have been the one that could have been the go-to. Okay? Now, there are some reasons why, especially with high-pressure situations, that players just can't hack it. And there are some players who, in the moment, can. And that's really one of the critical spots on that, is that, every player has an ability to perform to their optimal level, but it's in those moments that it counts, that either they're going to make it or break it, make it or choke. Okay, so we've got to pay attention to that, and you got to set players up for that, especially during practice. Okay, now there's a lot of different reasons internally and externally. It just depends on how it's perceived by each person. All right, so over arousal, appraising the situation as highly stressful, and maybe it's not. Loss of self control. You're expected to fail, and then those are internal. That's more you. Whereas external, we're talking more about crowd pressure. The fear of success. Coaching expectations, and then from pressures of others. All right, so that can become critical there. How do you measure choking? Well, how bad did they not perform? I mean, it's really that simple, but they give you other things here, but it's really, did you perform? And that's what it comes down to. But how does, in terms of physiological changes, what happens? Muscle tension, that's typically, because then you don't move correctly. Excessive sweating, high heart rate, you start feeling sick to your stomach. And then there's the stomach cramps, start getting those pains in your guts, But that's part of the process. And the more you become in those situations, the less that the choking can potentially become. Okay. So again, sometimes practice can be that thing that can help save an athlete and make them be able to, have a strategy and a plan to be able to just overcome that moment of, where they might feel like there's a threat or a worry. Okay, so some of those strategies, practice under game-like conditions. That's a good thing. Try to improve self-confidence of all players, because all players have a potential to be put in that situation. Expectations should be realistic. Put the contest and the sport into perspective. Don't put other things into that. Avoid pressure statements. You can do this. You got it. We know you can do it. All right. But no, that may seem really innocent, but it might not be. Okay. Focus externally. Try to focus on what's going on in that moment, and then, routines. All right. That's why players have specific routines. Okay. So 39 slides of fun when it comes to arousal, stress, and anxiety. This chapter kind of, just pay attention to each section. There were a bunch of things I said just to pay attention to in terms of testing. So definitely pay attention to those, because they're going to be available for you on the test. All right. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this and go through it. And like I said, I apologize for last week and not having these out and ready for you. But I think the material is still pretty easy to cover, but I think sometimes this might help by me doing these voiceovers. So I'm really thankful for all of you guys. I'm really thankful that you're taking the time to do what you have to do in this kind of not so optimal situation. So again, if you need anything, obviously send me an email, and shoot me a message so that we can kind of figure things out. All right. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.